Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Bekele Kachara Natural Processed Ethiopia from September Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Habtamu Fakadu Aga, a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that we were going to be reviewing a number of September's coffees here in the near future, and that includes this one, as this coffee caught my interest largely due to the listed blue slushy note. But in addition to that, I did want to try some of September's natural processed Ethiopian offerings, given that I've had some positive experiences with natural processed coffees this year. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe in a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So I don't believe that September ever came out with an extra light version of this coffee. I believe that they only had a standard profile for this one. And as a result, this one is still on the lighter side of things, as a lot of people still describe September's coffees as being lighter than a lot of Say's more recent offerings. And I could certainly see that with this one, even with the processing, as I feel like most people would describe this one as being a moderately light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60. And interestingly enough, the coffee was a little bit less defined than initially expected, as there's certainly a fair bit of a berry theme to it, but just a bit more fermentiness and a bit more brightness than initially expected, with the overall experience being just a bit more heavy than initially thought. And I do want to provide some context on that today, mostly because we did also receive a sample of the Mate Matios, the standard profile of that coffee as well. And I remember making that one before I made this one, and that one was a notable bit cleaner than this coffee did turn out. So after having had that coffee, I went into this one with some pretty high expectations that it would be just as, if not cleaner than that coffee. So when this coffee did turn out a little bit more bright and fermenty than I was expecting, I would say that it did have a little bit less of a positive experience than that one did. We are going to be reviewing actually the extra light profile of the Mate Matios, but I did want to highlight that experience mostly because that did play a role in my first impression of this coffee. Day 18 through the Chemex, and this coffee was already a fair bit cleaner this time around, as it does continue to focus heavily on the berry aspects in both a blue and red sense. Biggest takeaway I had was that there's a little bit less heaviness to it, but overall it was notably better. Day 21 through the April brewer, and the coffee is better again, as it's offering better clarity and a heightened focus on the listed blue aspects of the cup, while still offering additional red berry tones to the rest of it. Expectedly sweet without being overbearing, but still mostly just skewing in a very strong berry fruit direction. Day 24 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, so of course finer grind, higher temperatures, lower concentration, and the coffee was holding up well, as it's a bit more intense with equally clean experience, as it still has, I would say, an equally clean experience to the first couple of impressions that we did have, just a little bit more of that intensity. It was best off brew, as it does offer a very prominent blue intensity reminiscent of the listed blue slushy, but it did lose a little bit of its structure as it cooled down, better overall nonetheless. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee does continue to hold up well when pushed, as it does still offer a, we'll say, very positive impression right off brew with a strong sugary blue tint and a solid level of clarity for a natural processed coffee. Issues do remain as the cup does cool down, as it's offering less structure and an even slightly uneven brightness to it. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee at times can feel a little sensitive, as this did skew a bit more on the red fruit side of things relative to some of the earlier days. Outside of that, it was a bit better in the intermediary, as right off brew it was a little bit heavier, but then in that intermediary sense, it did have a uniqueness to it that was reminiscent of what I would actually describe as the Ngise Nari from Bots. We'll get into that a little later, with a very lingering finish to it. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the coffee is once again pretty blue, as it's offering a nice level of cleanliness and clarity with plenty of sweetness. Might actually be one of the better days of this coffee, as this was just notably better balanced in general. And on day 36, we went back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was the best day of the coffee to this point, and this day 40 mark is the best day of this coffee, so I feel like this one is continuing to improve with just a little bit more time, as it does have a pretty direct and unique blue tone to it that is very reminiscent of the listed blue slushy. But interestingly enough, there's another descriptor that I would say was a bit more in line with my experiences of this coffee, and that's the gummy shark note that Bots had listed on their Ingise Nare, as we did buy an entire bag of the gummy sharks to kind of see what that flavor is supposed to taste like. And honestly, this coffee tastes a little bit more like that to me than that Ingise Nare from Bots did, which was kind of interesting. More surprisingly high brightness, as there's a decent level of clarity with the listed berry aspects being a little bit less intense in some of the earlier days in the sense of being overly fermenty, as opposed to a little bit more clean and direct. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish and the sweetness together at the level 4. Both of those are certainly on the higher side of level 4, but I'm always happy when any sort of processed coffee doesn't skew into that level 5 territory of being overbearing, and I wouldn't necessarily say that this coffee ever approached the overbearing category. Yes, in terms of the fermentiness, it could have hindered the overall experience of this coffee from time to time, but that was mostly, I would say, a result of some very high expectations for this coffee going into it. But even then, having this one be a little bit more even towards the end, I'm happy with both of those things scoring that level 4 mark. Acidity, level 4. Another surprising thing is there was a fair bit more berry brightness than I was expecting from this coffee going into it. Granted, they do have a vibrant note listed here on the bag itself. I wasn't entirely sure what to make of that, but as far as natural processed Ethiopian coffees go, this one definitely skewed a little bit more on the brightness than initially expected. Florality, level 4, and that's certainly those darker perfumey floral aspects that are present within this one, though that usually goes hand in hand when it comes to coffees that skew heavily on the darker berry profile in general, so that one scoring there at the level 4 I don't necessarily think is a surprise. Berry fruit, level 4, and I think I have to say that the berry with this one was definitely more on the darker berry side of things, and I could easily see something like a blueberry. And at times, given that there was a slight bit of fermentiness, I could see a little bit of that strawberry, I could see a little bit of that lychee. But interestingly enough, given that this coffee was turning out a little bit more darker berry themed with a little bit more brightness, I think stuff like currants actually are a little bit more fitting with this coffee, though I did have somebody say that this coffee felt very vintage blueberry to them when they were trying it after I brewed it for them. So that's kind of an interesting note and takeaway. Nonetheless, it certainly skews on that berry side of things, and level 4 is certainly justified, and you can say higher side of level 4, maybe pretty close to that level 5 as well. Then we have one level 3, and it's the most important thing to discuss within this coffee, and that's the cleanliness. It's certainly on the higher side of level 3, and it feels like it's improving, but at the very end of the day, you can see and feel a little bit of that fermentiness that is present within this coffee. Though I still want to give it credit for being notably cleaner than the vast majority of natural processed Ethiopian coffees. Final thing worth discussing, body level 2, not necessarily the most amount of texture, as I didn't necessarily expect it to have that much, slightly lighter bodied. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I feel like I really want to save just my final thoughts in general on this coffee until our Mate Mateos review, because I'm very curious to see how those two coffees will compare by the end. Now, I did mention that I had such a positive first impression of the standard profile of the Mate Mateos, and that did lead to some extremely high expectations for this coffee that it didn't initially live up to. But this coffee has improved a lot every single time I do brew it, and I feel like it's still going to continue to improve from this point going forward. And I've already heard some preliminary feedback from others about this coffee as being extremely positive, and I can certainly see why. As far as natural processed Ethiopian coffees go, I do think that this one at the very least lived up to some expectations that I did have, which is interesting given that I had pretty high expectations for this coffee. September is one of my favorite Canadian coffee roasters. I've had a very good year with natural processed Ethiopian coffees, and this one at the very least living up to that expectation is very positive. I don't necessarily think it can live up to the experiences we've had with some of the other natural processed Ethiopian coffees, most notably some of the ones that we had from Wesson Kopi. But even then, as far as a standard profiled natural processed Ethiopian coffee goes, this one was great, and I have a lot of positive things to say about this one. type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This one is a bit more on the classic natural Ethiopian side of things, as it does offer a very prominent and pronounced berry tone to it. And I feel like at times it may be skewing a little bit too much in one specific direction, but that can be made up for by the fact that it is a little unique in certain regards. The sugariness is just a little bit more of a deviation than you typically experience from something like this. In addition to that, there's a unique brightness that does give it a little bit more character, and it is a little bit better balanced and well-rounded than a lot of other natural processed Ethiopian coffees go. So that's a lot of positives when it comes to this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Bekele Kachara natural processed Ethiopia from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.